All right, so you sent us on a deep dive this time, huh? A century of conflict in Palestine. That's some heavy stuff.
It certainly is. And complex, too. But that's why we're here to try to untangle it, to understand the why behind the headlines.
And this sheer volume of stuff you sent, wow. Historical documents, firsthand accounts, it's incredible, but where do we even start?
Well, I think what's really interesting about these sources is how they highlight the historical forces at play. We're not just talking about isolated events here, but these larger themes of colonialism, nationalism, the aftermath of global conflict.
Right, it's all connected.
Exactly. And to really grasp the roots of this conflict, we need to rewind a bit, go back to the early 1900s, to a time of rapid change in Palestine.
Okay, so early 1900s, setting the stage. What should people really be paying attention to?
Well, picture this. 1917, World War I is raging, and then enters the Balfour Declaration.
The Balfour Declaration. Yeah, we got a lot of requests to dig into that.
Rightfully so. It's only 67 words long. You could tweet it today. But that one letter from a British official had massive ripple effects.
It's incredible, really. Like promising one group a national home in a land that was already inhabited by another.
Precisely. And that's the heart of the issue. You can't talk about this conflict without understanding the impact of the Balfour Declaration. It essentially paved the way for the British Mandate period, like 1923-1948, which saw a huge influx of Jewish immigrants, many fleeing persecution in Europe.
Right, especially with the Holocaust, so many were desperately seeking refuge.
Absolutely. And while you can understand the need for a safe haven, the impact on the existing Palestinian population was profound. Displacement, rising tensions, and this growing sense of injustice.
And that's where we see the early stirrings of resistance, right?
Exactly. The Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939 was a significant moment. It wasn't just a blip on the radar. It was a full-fledged uprising against British rule and increasing Jewish immigration.
But it ultimately failed to achieve its goals.
It did. And what's tragic is the response it provoked. We see mass arrests, home demolitions, tactics that are sadly familiar even today.
A cycle of resistance and crackdown that, sadly, becomes a recurring theme in this conflict.
Unfortunately, yes. And as we move into the 1940s, things become even more volatile. The UN steps in, tries to play peacemaker with the 1947 partition plan, dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab.
Seems logical on paper, maybe?
But the reality was far messier. The proposed division was seen by many Palestinians as incredibly unfair. Imagine this. The side with a smaller population, less land ownership, gets more of the pie.
Of course, that didn't go over well.
No. And the Palestinian rejection of the plan set the stage for the 1948 war, a pivotal moment that Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe.
Right, the Nakba. Over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, villages destroyed. It's hard to even fathom that level of upheaval.
It was a deeply traumatic period. Events like the Deir Yassin massacre, where hundreds of Palestinian civilians were killed, underscored the brutality of this era.
And it's not just the historical event, right? The legacy of the Nakba, that sense of loss, of displacement, it's something that continues to shape Palestinian identity to this day.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to understand that context as we move forward, because the conflict doesn't end in 1948.
And you're right to point that out. The Nakba wasn't the end of the story. While hundreds of thousands were displaced, many Palestinians remained within the borders of the newly formed Israel.
That's right. It's a really important point. And their experience is crucial to understanding the complexities of this conflict. They didn't just disappear, you know.
So what happened to those who stayed? What did life look like for them?
Well, for nearly 2 decades, they lived under Israeli military rule. Imagine that being subject to a different set of laws, restrictions on your movement, limitations on your daily life, all while living in the same land that was once your home.
It's hard to even imagine.
It was a difficult period. They were granted full citizenship eventually, but that legacy of inequality, of being treated as other in their own land, those scars run deep. And keep in mind, all of this is happening while the situation for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip is also transforming.
Right, because those areas come under Israeli control after the 1948 war, if I remember correctly.
You're exactly right. And this is where we see the emergence of another key player, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, founded in 1964.
And the PLO is significant. Why?
Well, for the first time, you have a unified body representing the Palestinian people on a global stage. This is a pivotal moment in the struggle for Palestinian self-determination. Remember, this is a people who've experienced immense upheaval, displacement, and they're seeking a voice, a way to fight for their rights. And the PLO becomes that vehicle.
So it's about more than just armed resistance. It's about diplomacy, about advocating for their rights on the world stage.
Precisely. And it's against this backdrop of shifting alliances, this growing sense of Palestinian national identity, that we arrive at another turning point, the 1967 Six-Day War.
Another war. It's almost like clockwork.
It's a pivotal moment, and one that continues to shape the reality on the ground even today. Israel's victory in this war resulted in significant territorial gains.
You're talking about the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, all coming under Israeli control.
Exactly. And with that comes another wave of Palestinian displacement, more loss of land. They call it the ghaza, the setback.
Yeah.
Imagine. Within just a couple of decades, they've witnessed two major upheavals, each resulting in further displacement and loss. It's a recipe for deep-seated resentment, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's hard to see how you come back from that.
It's incredibly difficult. And to make matters worse, it's in the aftermath of the Six-Day War that we see the beginning of Israeli settlement construction in the occupied West Bank and Gaza.
The settlements. This is a topic that always seems to come up, but why are they such a big deal?
It's a critical point of contention. See, under international law, these settlements are considered illegal. They're not just some side issue. They're at the heart of the conflict.
Okay, so illegal settlements. What does that actually mean for the people living there?
Imagine this. You're a Palestinian living in the West Bank, and next to your village, you see these settlements springing up, inhabited by Jewish Israelis. They have access to resources, infrastructure, protection under Israeli law. You, on the other hand, are subject to military rule, checkpoints, restrictions on your movement, your access to resources.
It's like two different realities existing side by side.
Exactly. It's a system that inevitably creates tension, breeds resentment. And it's within this context, the ongoing occupation, the settlement expansion, the enduring trauma of the Nakba, the Naksa, that we see the eruption of the first Intifada in the late 1980s.
The Intifada, the Palestinian uprising, we've all seen the images, the young men, sometimes even children, throwing stones at tanks. David versus Goliath, right?
It was a remarkable period, really. From 1987 to 1993, it wasn't just about armed struggle. This was a true popular uprising, a mobilization of Palestinian society against the occupation. You saw civil disobedience, strikes, the creation of these amazing communal cooperatives, people coming together to resist as any way they could.
It sounds almost inspiring in a way, this spirit of resistance.
It was incredibly powerful. But we can't forget the response it elicited. The Israeli military employed harsh tactics, including what became known as the break their bones policy.
Right, a pretty brutal crackdown, if I'm being honest.
It was a dark period. But even amidst the tear gas, the violence, there were glimmers of hope for a peaceful resolution.
And that takes us to the Oslo Accords, right?
Exactly. The early 1990s, a moment of cautious optimism. We see the signing of the Oslo Accords, a historic agreement that, at least on paper, seemed like a path toward peace.
And that's where the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, officially recognizes Israel. And in return, Israel recognizes the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people. It felt like a huge step.
It did, and it paved the way for the creation of Palestinian Authority, the PA, an interim governing body for parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip.
So finally, some semblance of self-governance for the Palestinians. But did it work? Did Oslo actually bring peace closer? It really felt like a turning point at the time, didn't it? Like maybe, just maybe, they were on the road to peace.
There was a lot of hope surrounding Oslo, but as we know, the path to peace is rarely straightforward.
And Oslo was no exception.
Right? It ultimately failed to address some of the core issues fueling this conflict, most notably the settlements.
You said it before, but the settlements continued to expand, even with the Oslo Accords in place.
Exactly. So you have this agreement that's supposed to pave the way for a two-state solution, an independent Palestine, alongside Israel. But on the ground, the reality is far more complicated. The settlements never went away. They continued to grow, eating away at the very land that was supposed to form this future Palestinian state. It created a sense of, well, what was the point?
And how did the Palestinian Authority handle all this? I mean, they were this new entity tasked with governing a fragmented territory, still under Israeli control. This sounds almost impossible.
It was an incredibly difficult situation. And the sources we looked at, they offer a pretty nuanced view of the PA's role during this period. On the one hand, they were operating under immense pressure, both from Israel and from their own people.
Their own people.
Yeah, you have to remember, there was a lot of frustration building up among Palestinians. Many felt that the PA wasn't doing enough to push back against the occupation, that they were too willing to cooperate with Israel, even as the settlements expanded.
So this sense of a broken promise.
Exactly. And it's in this context, this powder keg of unfulfilled expectations and simmering anger, that the Second Intifada erupts in 2000.
And this time it feels different, doesn't it? Even more violent.
It was a very dark period. The spark that ignited it, at least symbolically, was Ariel Sharon's visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem.
Sharon, who later became Prime Minister of Israel.
Right. At the time, he was the leader of the opposition. But his visit to this highly sensitive site, sacred to both Muslims and Jews, it was seen by many Palestinians as a deliberate provocation.
And it set off this chain of events that quickly spiraled out of control.
Exactly. We saw a level of violence that hadn't been seen before. Suicide bombings inside Israel, targeted assassinations by the Israeli military, large-scale incursions into Palestinian cities.
And this is when they start building that separation barrier, right? The one that cuts through the West Bank.
Right, that's when construction begins. And it quickly becomes a symbol of the conflict itself.
Because for Israelis, it represents security, a way to protect themselves. But for Palestinians, it's just another symbol of the occupation, this physical barrier cutting them off from their land, their families.
Exactly. It further entrenches that sense of separation, of two separate and unequal realities. And all of this is playing out against the backdrop of another significant development, the rise of Hamas in Gaza.
Right, Hamas. That adds a whole other layer to an already complicated situation.
It does, because in 2005, Israel actually withdraws from Gaza. They dismantle the settlements there, pull out their troops.
Seems like a good thing, a step toward peace, maybe.
It could have been, but what happens is Hamas, which had been gaining popularity for years, partly through its social programs, wins Palestinian legislative elections in 2006.
And they take control of Gaza?
Yes. And this leads to a split within the Palestinian leadership. The PA maintains control in parts of the West Bank, but Gaza is effectively a separate entity now, controlled by Hamas. And Israel, they view Hamas as a terrorist organization, and they respond by imposing a blockade on Gaza.
Which is still in effect today, and it's had a devastating impact on the people living there, hasn't it?
It has. Officially, it's a security measure to prevent Hamas from acquiring weapons. But the reality is that it's crippled Gaza's economy, severely restricted the movement of people and goods. It's created a humanitarian crisis.
And then on top of all that, you have multiple wars in Gaza in 2008, 2012, 2014.
Each one exacting a terrible toll on civilians.
It's just wave after wave of violence, of suffering. It's hard to see any easy answers, any way out of this cycle.
It's incredibly complex, and there are no easy solutions. But what these sources drive home is the human cost of this conflict. The individual stories of loss, resilience, the desire for peace and dignity that I think exists on both sides.
It's something we can't forget, because it's easy to get bogged down in the politics, the history, but ultimately, this is about people's lives.
Exactly.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about with this deep dive. Over a century of conflict, it's hard to even grasp the scale of it.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but it's important, because this conflict, it doesn't just live in the past. It's still unfolding, still impacting millions of lives. So listener, if there's one thing you take away from this, it's to keep learning, keep asking questions. This deep dive, it's just a starting point.
It's a complex issue, but understanding is always the first step.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.